Good evening. I'm Muriel Bowser. I am Mayor of the District of Columbia, and I'm calling to order this meeting of the New Columbia Statehood Commission. This is the first meeting of the Statehood Commission for this calendar year. I would like to acknowledge all the members of the commission, and all the members of the commission are present. Let me start with my fellow co-chair, D.C. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson, United States Senator Paul Strauss, United States Senator Michael Brown, and United States Representative Franklin Garcia. I would also like to note that the meeting has been properly noticed, and the agenda items are before us. Let me review the agenda. Today's agenda is planned to cover a presentation on DC Statehood Organizational Plan, DC Statehood Organizational Structure. When I say that, I'm talking about the Statehood Advisory Referendum, Organizational Plan, Organizational Structure, and a review of the timeline, as well as a discussion of the New Columbia Statehood Commission FY17 budget. So with that, let me turn to Chairman Mendelson for any opening comments.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser, and good afternoon to my colleagues, the senators and the representative, as well as all those from the public who are here. I'm just going to make this point. The commission that's sitting here before all of you is a creation of council legislation a couple of years ago, where we looked at the resources that the government was putting into the statehood movement through various avenues, such as to the Office of the Secretary of the District of Columbia, but also a grant to the private sector that I believe usually has gone to DC Vote, and a number of different strategies. And it was our thinking that it would help with regard to statehood if there was a greater coordination between the executive, that is the mayor, the legislative branch, and the three who are elected to represent the citizens, the two senators and the representative, in pursuing this effort. And that is how the Statehood Commission came about, the New Columbia Statehood Commission came about. So we're required to meet a minimum of twice a year. I think ideally we would meet more frequently, and I think that's what we're talking about today in part. And we have really for the first time this greater coordination that you see before you, and the opportunity to talk about a more comprehensive strategy such as that which the mayor is laying out for us. And what I hope and believe will come out of this is that you will see more resources from the council, and I think as well from the executive branch, to assist our elected representatives in pursuing self-determination, and in particular statehood. So I'm looking forward to this discussion, and I think based on what the mayor's presented that we're going to see quite a bit of this over the next couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Strauss.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here today with our governor, with the chairman of our state legislature, and with our congressional delegation. I look forward to the day when we can send the governor back up to the governor's office, let the chairman of our state legislature preside over a sovereign body, and the three of us can go over to Capitol Hill, where we belong, and do the people's work in that building instead of hanging around here with you state officials. That being said, we have a lot of work to do before we get there, but I'm excited to be here as part of this commission. Come January, I will have had the privilege of serving the people for 20 years in office as your senator, and this is one of the most ambitious and exciting plans that we've had in a long time. Some will ask, we voted for statehood once, why are we doing it again? And the answer is, as a friend of mine who you might have seen on TV, Jonathan Banks, has said, a lot's changed in the past 30 years since we voted for statehood, but a lot hasn't. The people of D.C. still don't have equal rights. And I think this is important because we've had so many new citizens come to town that need to be re-engaged. It's one thing when your vote is ignored from a referendum that took place almost 30 years ago. It's another when a vote you cast this year is threatened to be ignored by Congress. Earlier today, one of our presidential candidates did something unusual in the statehood discussion. He told the truth. When asked about his objection to statehood, rather than hiding behind some historical argument, he said, "I just don't like that there's too many Democrats." And he's supposed to be the sensible one. We need to move this process forward. And Madam Governor, in the beginning when you came on, you made a commitment to the delegation that with the resources we had, if we could begin to produce some results, that you would be there behind us. I think we as a delegation have begun to produce some real results. We've taken our cause around the world and joined international organizations for unrepresented people, bringing unprecedented attention to our struggle in the global community. We've traveled around the country and enlisted groups in Iowa, Nevada, support in Hawaii, where Americans are taking up the cause of their fellow D.C. residents. Your strategy will expand that to all 50 states, and we're excited for the opportunity to work with you. But we recognize that there have been issues in the past that have not necessarily moved this program forward. But this, hopefully with the newfound coordination between the legislative, the executive, and our delegation, we can begin a way to engage the community, address those issues, and move this process forward. So I want to thank you for your leadership for this bold plan and the cooperation and resources that you've provided to our delegation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Senator. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Madam Governor. I just want to add to what Paul said. You know, I know there are some concerns about this plan, but I encourage everybody to hear what's going to be said today and to consider carefully what we're attempting to do. One of the problems that I've had in this job since I began is a lack of things, a lack of momentum. It seems that we get some momentum and then we stop. We get more momentum, then we stop. This has the potential to not only give us a great amount of momentum, but to keep the momentum ongoing until we reach our goal of statehood. We should remember that this is exactly what Tennessee did. Tennessee said, we're tired of waiting for you in Congress to bestow statehood upon our citizens, so we're going to come to Washington and ask you the question, the big question, do we get to be equal citizens or not? I think this proposal gives us the potential to do exactly that. And we have to remember we're on a roll right now. 71% of registered voters in the District of Columbia are for statehood. We've just had victories in the courts for budget autonomy and also Bacon-Davis. There was a court ruling the other day that sided with the District of Columbia. So we're on a roll. People are starting to recognize that we don't have the same rights that every other American citizen has, and that's wrong. And it's not people inside the District of Columbia. We've always realized that. But it's people outside the District of Columbia. So I think this gives us the perfect opportunity to take our battle to Capitol Hill. And I commend the mayor for coming up with this plan, and I encourage everybody here to hear it all the way through before you make any decisions on how you feel about it. Thank you.
Congressman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just very excited that we continue to find ways to fight for DC statehood. Very excited to be here and be part of this movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, fantastic. So what you've heard and what I have certainly promised is that we would continue to fight for statehood for the District of Columbia, and we would explore any and all ways to get there. So I challenged our team, led by Beverly Perry, the senior advisor to the mayor, who's also responsible for the Secretary's office and our efforts around statehood, to work work with leaders around the city to make sure that we were exploring all options. So I want to thank Beverly and all of the volunteers and people who have been thinking about this, who have helped us come to this day. So the one reason I asked Phil to put this item on the agenda is because this is not Muriel Bowser's plan. Okay, this is a recommendation that I'm bringing to the Statehood Commission, and it will need to not only be endorsed by all the people who care about it, but Washingtonians, period. So what people have told me, what the polls show, is that we have to continue to forge a new path to get the representation that we deserve. And we know, to be like all other tax-paying Americans, we need a vote in the House and we need 2 senators. And the only way to get there is to become the 51st state. So that is what this is about. Last week on Emancipation Day Eve, we set out kind of a bold step and a bold challenge to all of us to put this question on the ballot. And why is this time, different? What's different? And what we know is not only what the senator just mentioned, but there's never been more support among our own electorate for statehood than now. We also know that we have unlike 2008, and a lot of us reflect on this time when we had a new president, when we had the Senate, when we had the House, we did not have a contemporary plan. We did not have the voice of the people to deliver a package all wrapped up to the new president. Now when we have a new president, we pray that we won't have a financial collapse for the new president to fix. And we also hope to have a package, the DC voters saying we want statehood. And we may even have the opportunity for a different looking and sounding and rationally thinking members of Congress who, even in their own way, and you referred to what we heard the governor from Ohio say today, there was no logical explanation for denying 700,000 people who pay taxes in this country a vote in the Congress. And so we know that now is the time to make sure that is very clear to the members of Congress. Keep in mind, these are freedom-loving people. These are people who know how our country was founded, and we want to appeal to their logic and to their love of democracy. But we also want to be ready. So what what we're presenting to you today is how we can get an advisory referendum on November's ballot. And as has been discussed, there are 2 paths traditionally to statehood. The first is that the Congress passes enabling legislation, and we know that our Congresswoman has put such an act before the Congress for many, many years. The second, it also having been followed most recently by Tennessee, is that the territory, Tennessee in that case, or us, the district, would have everything all together. So the people would have voted, the people would have voted on boundaries, the people would have approved a state constitution, and the people would certify that they intend to have a representative form of government. So that is what we will ask the people of the District of Columbia to agree to this fall. So getting there takes a lot of work, as I'm sure you all can imagine. And so that is what we are coordinating now. How can we work together to get to the question on the ballot? So what I would like to put to the commission now is, and I have circulated to the commission members some draft background about how we get to the pathway for statehood. And I have already mentioned the things that we will need to do. So here are some key elements to getting to the plan, and I'm going to ask by a voice vote for the members to agree to. That we will will work toward, with citizen participation, drafting a constitution, that we will convene a constitutional convention, that we will create the boundaries for a federal district, that we will submit to the Council of the District of Columbia legislation asking for an advisory referendum on the November 8th, 2016 ballot. And so with that, I want to open up the floor for any discussion among the members.
I have a question. This question has been asked of me, and I think that it's appropriate to address it. I'm not exactly sure why we need a new constitution and why we need to vote on a Republican form of government. I mean, I guess I'm a little confused by that because we have a constitution and we've made that vote in the past.
Well, it was at least 30 years old.
Yeah,
it was passed in 1982. Many people who live in the District of Columbia now didn't live in the District of Columbia then, and even if they did, they may not have participated in that discussion. So it's my view that if we are to carry to the Congress and the new president next year, that the Constitution should be contemporary.
I also think it's important to recognize that when we began that process in 1982, the home rule government was only a few years old, and we were not particularly attached or engaged to the institutions that have now governed this city for many, many years. And so the Constitution that we drafted that had a multi-member House of Delegates, for example, gave us a very different form of government than what we have now. We have proven our ability to govern ourselves with a unicameral legislature in the current form that we've had for a while now. And we've taken incremental steps towards greater democracy, including the election of our own Attorney General. And so the biggest problem with the older versions of the constitutions, and there were actually two of them, is that they don't bear as much similarity to the government institutions that are important today. We want statehood to empower and enrich the lives of our citizens, and in order to do that, we want to make the transition as seamless as possible. And we know that one of the things that opponents of statehood are going to try and distract us with is how much will it cost, and what is it going to mean to change all this stuff around? Well, we have a functioning government. The part of the government that doesn't function is the congressional interference, and that's what we want to get rid of. We have commissions that function well at our local municipal neighborhood level. We have institutions that function well really at the state level. And so what we need to do is conform our Constitution to the government that exists now. And then, once we become a free and sovereign state, we as the people will have the ability to amend that Constitution time and time again, anytime we need to, without having to worry that those amendments will need to go forth and lay over in a congressional review period where any member from around the country can interfere with the wishes of our democratic voters. And frankly, we've had so many new people come to the city that it's an opportunity to engage them in that process and in the future of their community. Statehood for a long time has been a battle carried on by longer-term residents, but a passion that burns just as brightly in our newer residents. Yeah. And this process of civic engagement will re-engage, hopefully, both our longer residents and our newer residents in a united way of moving this process forward.
I'd like to add something just to sort of respond, Senator, to your questions. I think the mayor's proposal is a reasonable one. The value of this discussion here is that there are 5 of us, and the 3 of you, that is the folks who are popularly referred to as the shadows, and you're kind of in the trenches on this, to get your input on this. But I think it's a reasonable proposal. Given how Congress has viewed our efforts, I don't know that we can ask too often in different ways, or demand too often in different ways, that residents of the District of Columbia need to be fully enfranchised. So I don't I don't think that there's any harm in our asking again, and in fact, actually polishing off and updating the work that was done in 1982. And it's another effort, it's another strategy, it's another push, as you said, Senator Brown. It's a renewed effort with some momentum. I think that's all to the good. And
I agree.
if all we do is we just say, well, we're going to continue with, well, actually we adopted something back in 1982, which actually I think the council amended in 1987 or 1989. If that's all we do, I'm not sure that that has as much freshness. And so I think that this proposal is reasonable, and I don't see a harm in it, and I do think that it's actually better than just relying on what was done a couple decades ago.
I'm sold.
All right, very good. So the question before the commission is if we would endorse a plan to get an advisory referendum on the November 16th ballot. That includes updating the D.C. Constitution, convening a constitutional convention, creating a federal district, supporting legislation to the council to have the advisory on the ballot. That is the question. Is any further discussion? Discussion. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The next order of business is to review the organizational structure of the effort. You heard the chairman talk about the new Columbia Statehood Commission, which you see before you, that was created actually by Chairman Mendelson's initiative in a piece of legislation, I think, that went into effect in 2014. I recommend that the new Columbia Statehood Commission be the leadership group for the referendum action. And as such, it would be responsible for making sure that it would develop the rules, it would provide leadership to the working groups that I am going to discuss, and it would be responsible for making sure we have an updated constitution and making recommendations to the bodies that I mentioned. The Legal Advisory Committee I am going to describe next will help and advise the commission, would advise us. And we see this group as members of our legal community who want to actually be the drafters of the new Constitution, but also work on critical questions that will impact how moving the district into statehood would operate functionally. And so we will recruit members of the people who want to serve on the Legal Advisory Committee to the Statehood Commission. We have also come up with several working groups that would be a part of doing the very critical work that it will take to get us there. The list I'm about to read are suggested or recommended and shouldn't be considered final or exhaustive. But let me start with an all 8 wards committee. This would be the grassroots working group that works to get citizens to provide public education to residents of the District of Columbia. It would be responsible for public engagement in each of the district's 8 wards, including presenting to advisory neighborhood commissions and the like. Another working group would be the Map and Boundaries Committee. As of course, as part of the statehood initiative will be to ensure that a federal district is carved out of our existing boundaries and the new Columbia boundaries are established. The next committee would be the Rules Committee, and this committee would be responsible for drafting the rules by which the Constitution is presented in a constitutional convention and voted on. The next committee would be the All-Americans for DC Statehood, or otherwise known as the 50 State Committee. Members of this committee would be responsible for recruiting and energizing a DC Statehood group in each of the 50 existing states. The next group would be an advocacy committee, and this committee would be responsible for working with business groups, labor groups, national voting rights and civil rights groups, and would help with attracting resources to the statehood movement. The next committee would be the communications committee. This committee would use traditional new technologies to convey the DC statehood initiative inside of the city as well as across the nation. The next committee would be the Cleveland-Philadelphia Convention Committee, and we would seek co-chairs from each of the parties, for each of the major parties, to devise a strategy for the summer conventions. So that is those are that's the organizational structure, and so I want to put that proposed structure on the table for any discussion.
I want to make a couple of suggestions. One, I'm not sure that there should be a rules committee. I think that to the extent that rules are an issue, that should be held by the 5 of us. And I also think in the draft that you put forward, Madam Mayor, that it suggests that each of these working groups will be chaired by a council member, and I don't think that we should not consider that either the senators or the representative might want to chair any of these working groups. So I have those 2 comments.
Okay, I have no issue with removing as a suggestion a council member as chair. And the second suggestion was rules?
I think the rules should be kept with us.
Okay, any conversation around rules? Okay, so I would accept as friendly the incorporation of rules into the function of the Statehood Commission. Any objection? Without objection, the Rules Committee moves up and it is part of the function of the Statehood Commission. Therefore, the Legal Advisory Committee will be advising and helping with the work of that group.
I also have a question about the boundaries group. Since it seems to me that that's pretty much a technical issue, I don't know why we want to have a working group for that. It just, we've actually gone over the boundaries. We've had a geographer reestablish the boundaries, and there are some technical questions that need to be answered. But I'm not sure that, do we really want a group of, especially one comprised of, with citizen input on what the boundaries should be? Isn't that just a technical matter? And shouldn't we leave it to a geographer or some other technician to resolve that?
As I saw the committee, it involved some assistance from the Office of Planning. There are, at the time the original boundaries were drawn by the city, they used some old surveying techniques. Yeah. And if you've looked at our mapping technology today with global satellite, we've made a lot of strides. I do think that there would be some ways to talk about not just necessarily where the boundaries are, because that would be statute, but right. What we can do going forward to identify those boundaries, because there really are 2 distinct parts of the District of Columbia right now. There's the National Capital Service Area, where federal agencies pick up trash and have to shovel snow, and then there's the District of Columbia, where different sets of laws apply. So one of the positive aspects, I thought, would be how in the interim path to statehood we might use these already existing boundaries to help identify and get our fellow citizens used to where the new state boundary would be and what would remain in the federal district.
Well, let me add to that, and Senator, I might ask that we put this one kind of in a parking lot, but let's kind of talk through it here. We do, and I should mention, in the Congresswoman's legislation, she outlines with a meets and bounds description proposed boundaries. I have asked one of my staff to map out those boundaries. So the suggestion here is not that there needs to be dramatic change for that, but put the item up for discussion. The reason that there's a recommended committee in there, because there needs to be a division of labor. Now, to your point, if do we need a whole committee to do it? It probably doesn't need to be as robust as the other committees. So I am, I'm not wed to having a committee, and I'm happy to take any further suggestions about how this work can be done.
Well, I just didn't want to make a political football out of it, because there's part of Bethesda that I would really like. So
why don't we? So is it your recommendation that this is also something that the Statehood Commission, advised by the legal advisory team?
I think that would be a reasonable thing to do, yeah.
I'm going to put that on the table for a vote. All those, the senator has recommended that map and boundaries be a role performed by the Statehood Commission. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, the ayes have it. Okay, so hearing no further recommendations, I'm going to ask for approval of the organizational structure as amended. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. Let me move on to the third item on the agenda, which is the advisory referendum timeline. Let me start first, before we move into specific dates, or more specific dates, talk about how we propose public engagement around the referendum activities. First, we would have the working groups that we just described. We will be recruiting and looking for volunteers to serve on those committees. We think, a manageable, or my recommendation is that a manageable size for the committees would be about 40, but that could be up for discussion. And we would host a kickoff meeting among the Statehood Commission and the working groups on May the 5th. The working groups would need to commit to a timetable for their work, including public roundtables, discussion of working group recommendations, and recommendations that would go to the commission. And those meetings would need to happen between May 5th and June of 2016. We would make a presentation of the DC Statehood Advisory Referendum to a convening of advisory neighborhood commissioners by the first week of May. And we would need to make the presentation to the council. What date was that? I have that date wrong. What's the date? No, I'm sorry. The legislation to the council. By July. Then the council also may elect to do its own round of public engagement. And then we would host, before the legislation to the council, a constitutional convention where a draft constitution would be discussed on by mid-June. June 17th is a recommended date. And then the Board of Elections may also convene a public hearing on the draft language sent from the council. And that would have to be done by the end of July. Are there any questions on the timeline? And what I'm asking members to particularly pay attention to is if with this timeline, if we could commit to a kickoff meeting, commit to a public engagement process for the working groups and the commission, commit to the convening of a constitutional convention by the third week of July, and commit to sending a piece of legislation to the council for their consideration by that date. Any questions on the timeline? Exit discussion. It's aggressive.
Let me just say, in fact, you just said it, that this is aggressive, but it's a timeline, and I think it's worth trying, definitely worth trying. Keeps us moving, and it helps us measure whether we are being as efficient and decisive as we ought to be.
I agree it's an aggressive timeline, but it's an aggressive effort, and I think it's a cause that's worthy of such aggression.
So let me just also say a word about where we are, because we could take more time, and taking more time would mean we miss what I think is going to turn out to be a historic election in November, and we miss the opportunity for a new president to have a complete package from the voters of the District of Columbia. And so what we certainly have laid out is, and with this group being in place, can be very helpful. We've also laid out ways that we think these working groups can help spread the word and educate and take public input on every aspect of what's before us. So with that, yes.
I want to add one thing, so that everybody understands this. In the background information that's part of your proposal, it notes that, and I think this is a very important point, we had a new president, a Democratic president, in 2009. And I can't remember that far back, but I think we may have had majorities, and the Democrats, supporters, or at least folks who we presume to be supporters in both houses of Congress. But we didn't present anything new. And that's not to take away from what our congressional representative, Eleanor Holmes Norton, has been doing, because she's been introducing statehood legislation every session of Congress. But we, the local government, didn't present anything new. And key to your strategy, and I think the public needs to understand this because it speaks to why there's this timetable, is that if we could get this to the ballot in November and have that referendum, then that's the strongest way that we can request of Congress and the new president. So we start out in 2017 with a new, we know there'll be a new president, and there possibly will be different majorities in the House and the Senate. We start out with a bold request, which is what we haven't done in the past. And I think that's important to this strategy.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Anything else on timeline? Okay, all those in favor of the timeline before us, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. So with that, I want to move on to it's listed as item 5 here to discuss New Columbia Statehood Commission FY17 budget. I'm going to turn to the chairman to.
Sure, and I think this could be fairly brief. As everybody knows, the mayor's proposed budget for FY17 is before the council right now. And there is funding in it for the commission, and more particularly for the 3 elected representatives who are responsible for statehood issues. I think that with what we're doing today, it's worth just noting for a minute that the council could use a careful look by the 2 senators and the representative at what the budget needs are. And that's not an invitation to take the mayor's proposal and double or triple it, but as we move forward with this plan and this strategy, we ought to be looking as well at what the budgetary needs are. So that's really why I put this on here. I do not know if the senators want to, or the representative want to respond.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do find those comments encouraging. Many of the items that are going to be part of this plan, in some way, were anticipated by the Commission as part of its planning. We knew, for example, that we wanted to do outreach at the National Convention, and so we set aside funds in the Commission budget to make sure that we had that opportunity. We knew that we needed a state outreach category, and in fact, using our budget, we have already begun outreach to selected state. Our Iowans for D.C. statehood, our Nevadans for D.C. statehood. We've had interest in Hawaii and a few other states. But to be frank, we did not budget for a 50-state outreach program, and there's a lot of things here that we necessarily have not done. So we welcome the opportunity to study this plan and come up with essentially what the fiscal impact might be, and look for ways to work with your office and the executive to make sure that the resources are behind this effort so that in this very historic and unique opportunity we succeed with this ambitious and aggressive agenda.
Yeah, I would just add to that, absolutely. I think it's been a missing element in the past, and this is an aggressive timeline. And really, the big liability for us is if we fail in the vote. So we need to make sure that Washington, D.C. is well educated on this issue so that when the referendum goes forward, that we can count on the 71% of registered voters who favor statehood in coming out and voting for the referendum. We know that there are haters out there. We've already seen a letter in the Washington Post attacking the plan and asking what it will cost. So we know there's going to be opposition, and we need to be prepared for that opposition. And in addition to the outreach to 50 states and some of the other things that we've got here, the outreach in the city, we're going to need additional funds to do that. So I think it's appropriate to look at that. And thank you, Councilman Chairman Mendelson, for bringing that up. I think it's a very important element.
Okay, so let me also, to the members of the committee, ask for support, some staff support. The executive will provide staff support for each of the agents, for each of the working groups. We also would like to have the statehood delegation provide support, and the members of the council provide staff support as well to assist with staffing needs for each of the working groups in the short turnaround time that they have. I also wanted to put on the table, and we can discuss this after, a schedule of meetings of the commission during this time period where many decisions will have to be made, and we can circulate with no objection a schedule that will help us hit our points as well. I did want to advise that I asked the senior advisor and during this week we have been doing a lot of outreach to groups that in some cases the government has funded with grants. In other cases they've just been doing the hard work out there, period, around statehood for a discussion this afternoon about how we can populate the working groups as we move forward as well. We will create have we already created the website? Yes, it's up. Hello? Yes? Okay. So it is at statehood.dc.gov, where we will put all documents related to the commissions, and I'm sure we can connect with the council, Mr. Chairman, as well, for all of the documents related to the commission's meetings and the working groups meetings as well. Is there any further business? Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all. So because there's no further business, we will adjourn this meeting. I'm not sure what time it is. It's 4:25.